He humiliated and burned Chuck Norris's passport, and the next day he regretted it. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the two-lane highway that cut through the scrublands outside of Bartlett, Texas, painting the asphalt in waves of heat. The sky stretched wide and empty, a hollow blue expanse untouched by clouds, and the town itself slumbered quietly in the distance, unaware that something irreparable was about to take root on its outskirts. The roads were dry and cracked, flanked by tufts of stubborn grass and rusted barbed wire fences that seemed as old as the land itself. It was the kind of place where time forgot to run forward, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets clung to the soil like dust. Chuck Norris drove alone that day, his old pickup groaning gently beneath him as the tires rolled over the uneven blacktop. The truck, a battered F-150 from another decade, wore its scars proudly, the faded red paint chipped, the side mirror cracked, the engine humming like a content old dog. Chuck preferred it that way. It was a relic of a simpler time, before fame had boxed him in, before the cameras, the interviews, the exaggerations of his legend had swallowed his real self whole. His hands, rough and calloused, gripped the steering wheel loosely. On the passenger seat lay a small brown paper bag from the local diner. Chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes, nothing fancy. He had just spent the morning at the Bartlett Veterans Center, as he did every Wednesday, teaching self-defense classes and listening more than he spoke. His hair, now white as bone, was trimmed neatly, his beard full but clean. A simple man, invisible in his own town, exactly how he liked it. The highway curved gently ahead, the tires crackling over loose gravel on the shoulder as he slowed near the town's edge. That's when he saw it. The flash of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. Reflexively, he checked his speedometer. 45 miles per hour in a 45 zone. His signal had been on before the last turn. No reason, he thought, but he flicked the indicator and pulled onto the dusty shoulder anyway, letting the old truck idle beneath the brutal sun. The cruiser behind him parked at an angle, wheels kicked outward like a predator cornering its prey. Chuck watched through the side mirror as the officer stepped out, tall, stocky, built like a slab of concrete. Aviator sunglasses, freshly pressed uniform, holster angled arrogantly on his hip. Officer Bradley M. Murphy. The name stitched crisply above his heart, though there was nothing in the man's posture that suggested one. Chuck sighed quietly and waited. His window was already rolled down by the time Murphy swaggered up, one hand resting casually on his belt, the other adjusting his sunglasses as though the midday glare offended him personally. "License and registration," Murphy said without a greeting, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to giving orders. Chuck nodded without a word, reaching for the worn leather wallet tucked in his back pocket. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, well aware of how easily men like Murphy interpreted gestures as threats. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it over without a second glance, then leaned over to the glove compartment for the registration papers, the crinkle of old documents filling the silence. Murphy glanced at the license and snorted, the sound sharp and derisive. "Chuck Norris," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Chuck to hear. "Cute." Chuck kept his face still, betraying nothing. "You expect me to believe this?" Murphy continued, waving the license like a cheap playing card. "You know how many jokers I've stopped who think it's funny to fake an ID with a celebrity name?" "It's not a joke," Chuck said quietly, his voice even, measured. Murphy scoffed again and leaned against the hood of the truck, casually flipping the license over in his fingers. Sure it's not. He turned his head, eyeing Chuck's weathered face, the creases earned through decades of fights, losses, victories, and survival. You some kind of look-alike, little past your prime to be pulling stunts like this. Chuck didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, the soft rustling of grass beneath the dry wind the only sound between them. Murphy shook his head, amused by his own authority. You got anything else on you? Any other proof of this little fantasy? He held up the license as if it were contaminated. Without a word, Chuck reached into the side pocket of his jeans and retrieved a second card, an ID badge from the Bartlett Veterans Center, with his full name and photograph printed plainly. He handed it over. Murphy snatched it, examined it briefly, then laughed. A short, sharp bark of sound that felt more like a slap than amusement. Veterans Center, huh? That's rich. Trying to play the American hero card too? Chuck's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Murphy took a step back, sunglasses reflecting the midday sun. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver flip-top lighter. His thumb flicked the wheel, the flame small but steady in the breeze. Before Chuck could react, Murphy touched the flame to the edge of the license and the veteran's badge, holding them until the plastic curled and blackened, acrid smoke wafting between them. The documents crumbled to the ground, charred beyond recognition. There, Murphy said flatly, brushing his hands together like dusting off dirt. Problem solved. The fire had lasted only seconds, but the act lingered in the air like the smoke, suffocating and bitter. Chuck stood still, his hands unmoving, his expression unreadable. But something behind his eyes shifted, something cold and immovable, like stone beneath a river's surface. Murphy took a step closer, towering over the smaller, older man. What? You got nothing to say now? No tough guy speech? No viral video moment? Chuck finally met his gaze, and the quiet in his eyes was more dangerous than any retort. You just made a mistake, Chuck said softly. Murphy smirked, misinterpreting the calm as weakness. What are you gonna do, old man? Hit me? Go ahead. Chuck's eyes dropped briefly to the ashes at his feet, then lifted again, slow and steady. No, he said, I won't need to. Murphy shook his head, lips curling into something that resembled victory. Thought so. Behind them, unnoticed, a teenage boy in a battered Honda Civic sat frozen, phone raised discreetly above the dashboard. He had caught the entire thing, the lighter, the flame, the smirk, and the footage was already uploading to 3 different platforms by the time Chuck stepped back into his truck and pulled away, leaving only smoke, ashes, and an officer who didn't yet understand the match he had lit. That evening, the video reached 500,000 views in less than an hour. By midnight, it had crossed 2 million. By morning, the entire country would be talking, and the town of Bartlett, Texas, would no longer be the quiet place where nothing ever happened. But that was tomorrow's problem. For now, Chuck drove home in silence, the paper bag with his cold dinner still unopened beside him, and in his rearview mirror, the red and blue lights faded into the long, empty road behind him. The morning after the incident, Bartlett, Texas, woke up the way it always did. Quiet, unhurried, still tucked under the lazy weight of the southern sun. But something had shifted in the undercurrent of the town, something intangible but undeniable. The streets hummed differently. Phones vibrated more often. Conversations lingered longer in hushed tones at the gas station and the coffee shop on Main Street. Chuck Norris had no interest in watching the digital storm he unknowingly ignited. His phone had buzzed twice before sunrise, messages from an old friend in Dallas and a local news reporter whose number he hadn't saved. He left both unread, let the device slide face down on the kitchen counter like something fragile, something dangerous. The kettle whistled quietly on the stove, and he poured himself black coffee, the bitterness cutting through the heaviness growing in his chest. Across town, however, the video had already outrun him. A grainy, 30-second clip filmed from the cracked windshield of a teenager's Honda Civic was looping endlessly across social media. It was raw, unedited, brutally clear. Officer Bradley M. Murphy standing in front of Chuck's pickup, lighter in hand, setting fire to a state-issued driver's license and a veteran's ID badge. The flame licking plastic, the officer's smirk, the cold silence in Chuck's eyes. The caption beneath the video was simple but damning. Cop burns an old man's ID. Look who the old man is. By noon, it wasn't just Bartlett that knew. CNN ran a segment by mid-afternoon. Hashtags began trending. Hash burned, but not broken hash, Chuck Norris ID hash, Texas injustice. Comment sections swarmed like hornets' nests, people fighting over what it meant, over whether it was just a cop having a bad day or something darker, something systemic. Officer Murphy sat in the break room of the Bartlett Police Department, the cheap overhead lights buzzing faintly, a paper cup of burnt coffee going cold in his hand. His phone wouldn't stop vibrating. At first, it had been a few texts from his patrol buddies, some laughing, some asking what the hell he'd been thinking. Then the messages changed, took on a sharper edge. His name began trending on platforms he barely used. He didn't understand why it had blown up like this. In his mind, it had been nothing more than a routine stop, a bit of good old-fashioned tough love. A man pulls a prank with a fake ID. You call his bluff. Show him who's in charge. He hadn't expected anyone to care, but now the walls were closing in. His supervisor had already called him into the office once, voice tight with controlled anger, telling him to keep his head down until they could figure this out. By late afternoon, Murphy could barely step outside without recognizing the looks people gave him. It wasn't just the activists or the out-of-towners starting to gather outside the precinct with the hastily made signs. It was people from the neighborhood, clerks at the gas station, the girl who served coffee on Thursdays, even old men who used to nod politely when he passed. Their eyes were different now, measuring, watching. Meanwhile, Chuck stayed away from it all. He spent the morning at his gym, the same squat, windowless building he'd bought 20 years earlier when the lights and cameras faded and real life had started again. The gym was his sanctuary. The punching bags hanging heavy from the ceiling, the scuffed mats, the faint smell of sweat and vinyl, none of it had changed. He ran drills with a group of veterans, many older than him, men who moved stiffly but still carried a fighter's spark in their eyes. But he couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Not from the video, not from the rising noise outside. It wasn't about the ID. It wasn't even about the officer. It was about how easily a person could decide another man's worth was flammable. In the afternoon, as the protests began forming outside the police station, no more than 24 people at first, signs scrawled with "No justice, no peace," and "We stand with Chuck." Chuck drove across town to check on Mr. Harold Denton, one of the older veterans he visited weekly. Harold's front porch sagged under its own weight, and the old man sat in his rocking chair, radio playing softly at his side. "You all right, Harold?" Chuck asked, parking the truck by the curb. Harold looked up with watery eyes and nodded once, then shook his head. "Heard about what that son of a bitch did," he said without ceremony. "I served 2 tours in Nam. Never thought I'd live long enough to see the day they'd burn an American veteran's ID like trash." Chuck sat on the porch beside him, listening quietly as the old man talked, not about the video, but about the long thread of small humiliations men like them had endured. Harold spoke of stopped cars, questioned papers, lingering looks that said without words, "You don't belong here." When Chuck left, the sun was sinking low, and the noise around town had grown louder. News vans had started to appear. Protesters' numbers had doubled. Local news anchors positioned themselves in front of the precinct, holding microphones like weapons. That evening, as dusk fell and the air cooled, Chuck walked the short distance from his gym to the diner on Main Street. He hadn't eaten all day. When he stepped inside, the conversations stopped. Heads turned. The waitress behind the counter, Marie, a sweet woman who'd served him coffee for 15 years, approached cautiously. "We're with you, Chuck," she said softly, almost apologetically, as if she wished the weight of it all wasn't on his shoulders. Chuck nodded and took his usual seat by the window. He watched as people outside marched past, chanting now, the signs clearer, louder, "Respect is not optional." He burned a passport. We burn injustice. A few tables over, a group of teenagers sat hunched over their phones, scrolling furiously. One of them looked up, eyes meeting Chuck's for a split second, and in that glance, Chuck saw something more dangerous than anger: expectation. Back at the police station, Officer Murphy stared blankly at the muted news channel in the break room. His phone lay face down beside him, buzzing every few seconds. His wife hadn't called back. His supervisor had told him to take personal leave. Outside the precinct walls, the chanting was steady now, rhythmic and relentless. He still didn't understand. In his mind, he'd just taught an old man a lesson in authority. It hadn't been about race or power or humiliation, or maybe it had been, but not in the way they all said. He didn't see himself as the villain. He never had, but the world no longer cared about how he saw himself. As night fell over Bartlett, the town felt stretched thin, straining at the edges of something much larger than itself. A spark had caught in the dry grass, and now the winds were carrying it beyond fences and streets. Chuck sat alone in his gym long after the doors were locked, the heavy bag swinging gently in front of him, untouched. His phone vibrated again. Another message from a reporter he didn't know, another invitation to tell his side. He didn't respond, because it wasn't about his side. It was about the ashes on the asphalt and the question no one could unsee. How easily can someone burn your dignity and walk away? Outside, the chants grew louder. The fire was spreading. The days following the eruption of public outrage settled over Bartlett like a humid storm, thick and heavy, pressing against the town's chest. What had begun as a spark had become a steady blaze, no longer just digital noise but something physical, present in every conversation, every glance exchanged over a diner counter, every cautious whisper at the grocery store. It lingered in the spaces between people, stretching farther than anyone had expected, certainly farther than Officer Bradley Murphy had anticipated. Chuck Norris remained, as he had since the first video surfaced, on the outskirts of the noise. The chants outside the police station grew louder each night. Media vans crowded the narrow streets, social media feeds flooded with hashtags, demands, and debates. Yet Chuck's gym door remained locked during the day, the lights dimmed inside. He spent most mornings alone in the cool shadow of the old building, running through drills with no audience, movements sharp and methodical, like a man keeping something inside from breaking loose. But outside, the world kept moving. Officer Murphy, on the other hand, was sinking fast. His personal leave had become an unofficial suspension. Every day he woke to headlines that used his name like a curse. Former friends avoided him. Colleagues at the station refused eye contact. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's house 2 towns over. His world, once small and solid, was crumbling around him, and the only thing he could see was the man who started it all, the man in the pickup truck with the quiet eyes and the unshaken silence. The more the world condemned him, the more Murphy convinced himself that Chuck Norris was to blame, that the old man had manipulated the crowd, used his name and the weight of public sympathy to tear Murphy's life apart. In his mind, it wasn't about the badge anymore. It was about pride, about winning a game he didn't remember starting but couldn't afford to lose. The first time he orchestrated another stop, it was almost instinct. He sat in his car one afternoon, engine idling on a side street, when he spotted the battered red pickup turn a corner 3 blocks down. The decision to follow was immediate, thoughtless. He didn't radio it in. He didn't log it. He just let the cruiser slip quietly behind, keeping a measured distance as the truck moved through Bartlett's narrow streets. Chuck noticed, of course. He noticed the second time, too, when Murphy's cruiser passed him slowly on his way to the Veterans Center, headlights lingering in the rearview mirror just a little too long. And the third time, when the officer parked across the street from his gym and sat motionless for over an hour. Murphy's presence became a shadow stitched into the corners of Chuck's days, a quiet threat that hovered like a storm cloud refusing to break. It wasn't fear that tightened in Chuck's chest. It was something older, deeper, a gnawing awareness of how far men like Murphy were willing to go when they felt the world slipping from their grip. He'd seen it before, in different uniforms, in different countries, long before hashtags and trending topics. He knew the look in Murphy's eyes wasn't just anger. It was desperation. It escalated quickly after that. Late one evening, a neighbor knocked on Chuck's door, voice tight with worry. Someone had smashed the headlights of Chuck's pickup, a rock still lying in the driveway, shards of glass scattered like confetti across the gravel. The next day, the fence behind the gym was spray-painted with crude insults, hastily scrawled but clear in their meaning. When Chuck checked the security footage, the figure was barely recognizable, face obscured by a hood, but the gait, the shoulders, the build was unmistakable. He didn't call the police. There was no point. Instead, he started asking questions. Over the next week, Chuck moved carefully, quietly, piecing together a picture of Officer Murphy that had nothing to do with the headlines or the official statements issued by the department. He spoke with people around town who usually kept their heads down: the cashier at the corner store, the mechanic who fixed patrol cars, the widow who lived 2 streets over and rarely left her porch. Stories surfaced like bones unearthed after a storm. A young man who'd been pulled over 3 times in 1 week without cause. A single mother who'd filed a complaint about Murphy's behavior years ago, only to have it quietly dismissed. An older black veteran who described a stop almost identical to Chuck's own experience. His papers questioned, his dignity bruised, the encounter erased from official records. Each story added weight to the growing understanding of what Chuck already knew instinctively. Murphy's aggression wasn't new. It was a pattern, a quiet thread running beneath the surface of the town for years, protected by silence and the comfort of small-town ignorance. But the final straw came when Chuck received a phone call from Harold Denton's daughter. Her voice trembled on the other end of the line as she explained what had happened. 2 nights earlier, Officer Murphy had knocked on Harold's door under the pretense of conducting a wellness check. Harold, frail and wheelchair-bound, had opened the door only to be questioned aggressively about his paperwork, his status, his affiliations. The officer had stayed too long, asked too many questions, left only when the daughter arrived, and threatened to call internal affairs. Chuck hung up the phone quietly and stared at the empty gym around him, the faint echo of Harold's name ringing in his ears. He understood then that Murphy wasn't going to stop. This wasn't about discipline or oversight. It wasn't about badges or procedures. It was personal. It was a man clinging to power the only way he knew how, by trying to break what he couldn't control. That night, as the noise outside the police station swelled into a steady roar and reporters angled for better sound bites, Chuck made a decision. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and spoke only once the line connected. "I need you to arrange something," he said quietly. "Tell Murphy I want to meet. No cameras, no crowd, just him and me." The message took less than a day to reach its target. Murphy heard it from a colleague who wasn't supposed to be talking to him. The words passed down like a dare. At first, he laughed, shaking his head at the absurdity of it. But as the hours wore on, the laughter died in his throat. He agreed. The location was set, a long-abandoned police training facility on the outskirts of town, forgotten by budget cuts and time, left to rot in the weeds. It was the kind of place no one would think to look, the kind of place where grudges could settle without interruption. Chuck stood in the empty gym the next evening, the air stale with the scent of dust and mildew, the faint echoes of years-old drills still lingering in the walls. He traced a slow circle around the room, footsteps light, every sense sharpened. He wasn't there to fight. Not yet. He was there to end something. As the sun slipped below the horizon and shadows spilled long across the cracked concrete floor, he waited. Murphy arrived 10 minutes late, alone, eyes sharp and coiled tight like a man ready to pounce. He didn't speak when he stepped inside, didn't offer any greeting. His hands curled at his sides, shoulders tense. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Chuck finally broke it, voice calm, steady. "I came here because this ends now." Murphy's lips twitched into something almost resembling a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was nothing left of amusement in him, only something brittle and dangerous. "It ends when I say it ends," he replied. Chuck nodded once, as if he expected nothing else. Outside, the night pressed in quietly around the empty building, the protests downtown still echoing faintly in the distance. The trap had been set, and soon it would be sprung. The air inside the old police training facility smelled like rust and mildew, stale and suffocating, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The large overhead lights no longer worked. Their fixtures hung crooked, empty sockets like hollow eyes watching from above. Moonlight spilled through the high, broken windows in strips, cutting shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Dust lingered thick in the corners, drifting lazily whenever footsteps disturbed it. Chuck Norris stood alone in the center of the gym, his back straight, hands at his sides. He wasn't dressed like a fighter. There were no gloves, no wraps, no protective gear, just an old black hoodie, faded jeans, and the same battered boots he'd worn the day Officer Murphy burned his ID on the side of the road. The silence in the space felt almost sacred, heavy with things unsaid. For a long time, Chuck simply breathed, each inhale slow and measured, each exhale deliberate, grounding. He had spent his life preparing for fights, in the ring, in the field, in life itself, But none of those fights felt quite like this. This wasn't about titles or pride. This wasn't even about the past. It was about the thin, brittle thread of control that one man had tried to hold over another. It was about whether dignity could be extinguished like plastic in a flame. Outside, the world continued to burn in its own way. The protests downtown had swelled to hundreds by now, their chants rolling like distant thunder through the quiet streets of Bartlett. News vans lined Main Street like vultures, waiting for another headline, another image to feed the masses. But here, in this forgotten space on the town's edge, none of that mattered. Here, there would be no cameras, no audience, only reckoning. The door creaked open behind him. Chuck didn't turn. He didn't need to. He heard the footsteps, heavy, purposeful, each step echoing too loudly in the empty space. Bradley Murphy entered like a man walking into a battlefield, his broad shoulders squared, his chin set, his eyes narrowed against the dim light. He wasn't wearing his uniform tonight. He'd shed the badge and the weight of authority that came with it, trading them for a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, like a man who wanted to be ready for something primal. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound sharp in the hollow gym. Murphy stopped 10 feet away, his posture stiff, tense. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of the town beyond, the soft whistle of wind through broken glass, and the faint creak of old pipes in the walls. Then Murphy broke the silence, his voice lower, rough around the edges. "You wanted this meeting, so here I am." Chuck finally looked at him, his gaze steady but unreadable. He didn't speak immediately. He let the moment stretch, let the weight of it settle between them. "I didn't want a meeting," Chuck said quietly. "I wanted an ending." Murphy let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah? You think you get to decide how this ends?" Chuck didn't flinch. "No, but I decide how I stand in it." Murphy's jaw tightened. The veins in his neck pulsed visibly beneath the pale glow of the moonlight. His hands flexed at his sides, itching for something he couldn't name. "You think you're better than me," Murphy said after a moment, voice shaking ever so slightly beneath the anger. "That's what this is, isn't it? You've got the crowd, the cameras, the whole damn country eating out of your hand, playing the victim. And me? I'm the bad guy." Chuck's expression didn't change. He took a step forward, slow and measured. "You burned my name," he said softly. "Not just my ID. You tried to erase me." Murphy's eyes flashed. "Because you think you're untouchable. You walk around like some kind of saint, like you're above the law, but you're not." Chuck's gaze remained level. "Neither are you." The words hung between them like a drawn line. Murphy took a step closer, his shoulders coiled tight. "You think this is about a damn ID?" he spat. "It's not. It's about respect. It's about order. People like you, old men clinging to glory days, thinking the rules don't apply." Chuck shook his head slowly. "This was never about rules. This is about how you use them." Something in Murphy's face shifted then, something small and dangerous. A flicker of something beyond anger, something closer to fear. Without warning, he lunged. His fist came fast, a wild swing meant not to win, but to hurt, to knock Chuck back, to break something. Chuck moved like water. He sidestepped, the punch grazing past him, and planted his feet solidly on the concrete. He didn't counter. He didn't raise his fists. He just stood, watching. Murphy came again, quicker this time, years of training buried beneath rage. His shoulder collided with Chuck's chest, forcing him back a step, but Chuck absorbed the impact, letting it roll off him without retaliation. The sound of their struggle echoed hollowly in the empty gym. Grunts, shuffling feet, the sharp intake of breath when Murphy's frustration bled into every movement. But Chuck remained still. He dodged, deflected, refused to hit back. And that, more than anything, enraged Murphy. "Fight me," Murphy roared, swinging again, breath ragged. "Come on. You want to end this? Then hit me." Chuck's jaw tightened. He could feel the old instincts thrumming beneath his skin, the muscle memory of 1,000 fights urging him to strike, to retaliate, to end it clean. But he didn't. He waited. Murphy's punches grew sloppier, heavier, desperation bleeding through every swing. Sweat slicked his forehead, his breathing ragged now, the fight leaving him inch by inch with every missed blow. Finally, Murphy staggered back, chest heaving, fury burning out in his eyes like a dying flame. Chuck straightened, taking one slow step forward. "This is why you'll never win," he said quietly, "because you don't know the difference between power and strength." Murphy's fists fell to his sides. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps. Before either man could speak again, another sound sliced through the silence, the faint, unmistakable click of a door opening. Both men turned. In the doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight, stood two figures in dark clothing. One held a camera. The other wore a headset. They weren't reporters. They weren't protesters. They were there for proof. Murphy's face drained of color as he registered what he was seeing. He took an instinctive step back, eyes darting between the camera and Chuck. Chuck didn't move. He hadn't needed to set a trap. He'd only needed to give Murphy the rope. The two figures stepped fully into the light now, revealing Captain Allen, head of internal affairs, and a local journalist who'd been quietly gathering footage since the investigation began. Captain Allen's voice was calm, clipped. "Officer Murphy," he said, "you're under investigation for misconduct, harassment, and multiple counts of abuse of power. We have everything we need." Murphy stood frozen, breath shallow. Outside, the distant noise of protesters drifted through the broken windows like a low tide, steady and relentless. Chuck turned his gaze back to Murphy one last time. "This is how it ends," he said, and then he walked away. The echo of Chuck Norris's footsteps faded quickly behind him as he left the old gym, swallowed by the dry, still night. The building remained behind him like a ghost of something ugly that had finally been dragged into the light. Inside, Bradley Murphy stood motionless, pinned not by fists or violence, but by something far heavier. Exposure. The weight of being seen for what he truly was. Outside, the night air was cool, the faint hum of the town lingering on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets, the protest still rolled like a wave. Signs raised, chants carried over pavement and rooftops. But here, in the dark between one moment and the next, there was no sound except the rhythmic fall of Chuck's boots against the concrete. The trap had been sprung, and now the storm would follow. The footage from the gym surfaced within hours, first on local news, then on national broadcast, spreading with the same wildfire intensity as the original video of the roadside incident. But this time, it wasn't grainy phone footage or hurried whispers in comment sections. It was clear, deliberate, damning. Murphy's aggression, his loss of control, the bitter truth of who he had become, all of it unspooled in front of an audience that no longer gave him the benefit of the doubt. By the following afternoon, the Bartlett Police Department released an official statement, terse and measured, announcing that Officer Bradley M. Murphy had been placed under immediate suspension pending formal charges. Internal Affairs launched an official review. Protesters outside the precinct cheered when the news broke, but there was no celebration in their voices. Only relief, exhaustion, the hollow victory of knowing the fight wasn't finished. Chuck watched the coverage from his gym, the television muted, headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen like a warning. He didn't smile. He didn't react. Instead, he sat alone beneath the dim lights, taping his hands in slow, steady movements, as if he were preparing for a fight that hadn't ended. Because it hadn't. The investigation widened quickly. Threads pulled from the edges of Murphy's service record revealing a far more tangled mess than anyone had expected. Old complaints resurfaced, filed away years ago, dismissed quietly, buried beneath bureaucracy and silence. Testimonies from civilians began to stack like bricks, each one a quiet indictment of a pattern that had festered in plain sight. The department had known, or at least they had chosen not to know. Captain Allen held a press conference 3 days later, standing stiff and formal at the podium, the weight of the department's failings etched into the lines of his face. He spoke of accountability, of procedure, of policy changes that would follow. But the words rang hollow beneath the weight of what had already happened. Murphy's trial began within weeks. The courtroom was small, old wood benches worn smooth by years of similar proceedings, but never one quite like this. Local news crews packed the hallway, protesters gathered outside each day, their signs quieter now, not demanding justice but waiting to see if it would actually arrive. Murphy sat at the defendant's table, suit ill-fitting, shoulders hunched. He looked smaller than he had that night in the gym, something in him broken and caved inward. His attorney spoke in clipped professional tones, arguing technicalities, mitigation, intent. But none of it mattered. The videos spoke louder than any defense. Chuck testified once. He took the stand without ceremony, without rehearsed statements or dramatics. He spoke plainly, steadily, recounting not just what happened on the side of the road or in the gym, but everything in between. The slow, deliberate escalation, the choices made again and again to humiliate, to dominate, to dehumanize. When he stepped down from the stand, he didn't look at Murphy. He didn't need to. The jury took less than a day to deliberate. Murphy was found guilty on multiple counts: abuse of power, harassment, unlawful conduct, and attempted coercion. He was sentenced to 5 years without the possibility of parole. Not the maximum, but enough. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read. No cheers, no applause, only the quiet acknowledgement of something long overdue. Afterward, Chuck walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the sky stretching wide and endless above him. A crowd had gathered outside, reporters clustered behind their microphones, supporters standing with folded signs and tired eyes. He paused only briefly when they called his name. "What's next for you, Mr. Norris?" The question lingered in the air like dust. Chuck didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the faces in front of him, the strangers who had marched for him, the neighbors who had learned to speak out. The quiet eyes of people who had seen something ugly burned away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "This was never about me." The next morning, the headlines shifted. No longer about Murphy or the trial or even the protests. Instead, they carried news of something new, the formation of a foundation, its mission clear and unequivocal: ashes of dignity. The announcement came with little fanfare: a press release, a quiet website launch, a single interview on a local radio station. But the message was unmistakable. The foundation would offer legal aid to victims of police misconduct and bureaucratic abuse. It would provide resources for veterans and the elderly, people who had spent their lives serving only to find themselves discarded or disrespected. It would educate, advocate, and protect. Chuck didn't appear in the interviews. He didn't need to. His name alone was enough. Behind the scenes, he worked quietly, meeting with lawyers, community leaders, organizers. He spent long nights at his gym drafting plans, mapping out outreach programs, funding clinics. He spoke to veterans who had been ignored, to families who had been harassed, to people whose dignity had been treated like something disposable. The town of Bartlett changed too, in small but visible ways. The police department underwent a full audit. New training programs were implemented, focused not just on procedure, but on empathy, on humanity. Officers began wearing body cameras, accountability measures strengthened, complaint processes overhauled. None of it erased what had happened. But it was a start. One evening, weeks after the trial had ended and the noise had settled into something quieter but no less important, Chuck returned to Harold Denton's house. The old man sat on his porch, radio humming faintly beside him, the creak of his rocking chair steady. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't talk about Murphy. They sat in silence, the kind of silence that stretched easy between men who had seen too much and expected little. When Chuck finally rose to leave, Harold spoke without looking at him. It takes more strength not to hit back than to land the punch. Chuck paused, then nodded. The next morning, as the sun rose over Bartlett, the first community event hosted by Ashes of Dignity began in the town square. It wasn't large, a few tents, some folding chairs, pamphlets stacked neatly on tables. But people came. Veterans, students, families, strangers. They listened. They asked questions. They stood together. And Chuck, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, understood that the fight he had been forced into was only ever the beginning. The fire Murphy had lit hadn't burned him. It had illuminated everything. The sky over Bartlett carried a softer hue in the weeks that followed, as if the town itself was learning how to breathe again. The noise had settled, not vanished, not forgotten, but shifted into something quieter, something watchful. Where once there had been shouting and signs raised high, there were now conversations over coffee counters, thoughtful glances exchanged on street corners, and a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that the place would never quite return to what it had been before. The headlines faded, as they always did. Reporters packed their vans and rolled their cameras elsewhere, chasing the next fire, the next scandal. The protesters drifted back to their lives, some changed by the stand they had taken, others weary, their voices hoarse from nights spent chanting beneath the courthouse windows. But the work hadn't stopped. The Ashes of Dignity Foundation grew in small, deliberate steps, the way real change always does, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. It began in Bartlett, but it did not stay there. What had started as one man's refusal to strike back became something larger, a ripple across communities that had long been told to stay silent, to accept the weight of someone else's authority pressing on their backs. Chuck Norris remained at the center of it all, though not in the way the world expected. He declined interviews. He turned down television appearances and speaking tours. Instead, he kept to the edges of the work, meeting with veterans groups in dusty halls, sitting quietly at the back of legal clinics as volunteers explained citizens' rights, funding programs without attaching his name to every banner. He knew better than anyone that this had never been about him. Bartlett itself began to shift in ways both subtle and significant. The police department's audit unearthed uncomfortable truths, not just about Murphy, but about a culture that had protected him, turned away when they should have spoken. New policies were drafted. New leadership brought in. Officers began to wear body cameras, but more importantly, they began to listen. The old training facility where the confrontation had taken place remained empty, its broken windows boarded over, its walls marked by echoes only a few men would ever truly understand. On the far side of town, something else rose in its place. The Ashes of Dignity Community Center opened quietly one Saturday morning. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no speeches, just an unlocked door, freshly painted walls, and a space carved out for those who had been made to feel small. Inside, a mural stretched across the back wall, a simple image of a passport burning at its edges, but from the ashes, a tree grew tall, its branches stretching wide enough to cover anyone who stood beneath it. Chuck stood before that mural the night before the doors opened, the room still empty and echoing. He traced the lines with his eyes, the message woven plainly into every stroke of paint. Strength wasn't in the flame. It was in what survived it. That night, he returned to the gym, the place where so much of his life had been shaped and sharpened. The heavy bag still hung in the far corner, worn and scarred from years of use. He didn't hit it. He hadn't in months. Instead, he sat on the edge of the ring, hands resting on his knees, the silence of the space settling around him like an old friend. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Mia Sanders, the Foundation's coordinator, stepped inside, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She had been instrumental in building the infrastructure of the Foundation, tireless and sharp, but tonight her expression was softer. "They're here," she said simply. Chuck nodded once, rising slowly. His joints protested, but his movements were steady, grounded. Outside in the main gym space, a group of young men and women stood waiting. Some were veterans, others students, some who had crossed the Foundation's path in other ways, names plucked from court records, shelter rosters, classrooms. They wore plain T-shirts printed with the Foundation's emblem, hands wrapped not for a fight but for training. Chuck stepped in front of them, his gaze steady, the room falling quiet at his presence. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked slowly down the line, meeting each pair of eyes, recognizing the weight each person carried. They weren't fighters, not in the way the world understood, but they knew something about survival. Finally, he stopped at the center of the room. "You've heard my name," he began, voice low but carrying easily. "You've seen the headlines, the videos. You know the story they told." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But that story wasn't about me. It was about what happens when someone tries to take from you what can't be burned." He held up a pair of training gloves, the leather worn but clean. "You can train your body to defend itself," he continued. "That's easy. But the real fight is knowing when not to strike, when to stand your ground without swinging." One of the younger students, a teenager no older than 17, raised his hand hesitantly. "What do you do?" the boy asked, voice soft. "When someone disrespects you? When they try to tear you down?" Chuck met his gaze without hesitation. "You let them underestimate you," he said, "and then you teach them the lesson of their life." The next hour passed in quiet instruction. No shouting, no dramatics, just steady movements, deliberate stances, the rhythm of discipline over violence. It wasn't about fists, it was about something older, deeper. A lesson stitched into every parry, every block, every decision not to strike. Outside the gym, the world continued its slow, messy march forward. 3 months after Murphy's sentencing, the Ashes of Dignity Foundation expanded to 5 new cities, their mobile legal clinics staffed with volunteers who had once stood on the other side of a badge. Community programs flourished, teaching citizens their rights, offering refuge and resources to those who had been made to feel powerless. The video of Murphy burning Chuck's ID found its way into police training seminars, not as a cautionary tale about rage, but as a lesson in restraint. Departments across the country began to study it. Not the officer's smirk, not the flame, but the man who hadn't hit back. Somewhere, inevitably, other fires burned. Other headlines flared and faded, but in the spaces between, the roots of something sturdier took hold. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Bartlett streets in gold, Chuck sat alone on the porch of the community center, watching the quiet unfold. Mia joined him after a while, a folder in her hand. "You know," she said, settling beside him, "the numbers came in. We've helped over 200,000 people in the last 90 days. Chuck nodded once, but his gaze remained on the horizon. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "It's a start." They sat in silence after that, the hum of cicadas filling the spaces between words. Across town, in a prison facility tucked behind high walls and razor wire, Bradley Murphy sat alone in a concrete cell, the flicker of the overhead light casting long shadows on the wall. He had no television, no visitors. He watched the Foundation's coverage only when the guards left the common room TV on, turning down the volume but never fully looking away. The world had moved on without him, and it was better for it. Chuck knew that when he visited the Veterans Center on Wednesdays, when he stood at the front of his gym teaching footwork and patience, when he sat in council meetings pushing for reform, the fight wasn't over. But it was different now. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Bartlett held a small gathering in the town square. No media vans, no chanting, just neighbors, families, the people who had lived through the storm and come out on the other side. At the center of the square, a new mural had been painted. A figure stood tall at its heart, not a hero, not a fighter, but a man, plain and steady, standing before a wall of flame. And from the ashes beneath his feet, flowers grew. That night, Chuck spoke briefly to the crowd. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest thing in the world isn't standing up to a man with power. It's standing still long enough to show him he never had it." And when the applause faded and the lights dimmed and the town returned to its quiet rhythm, Chuck walked home beneath the stars, the weight of the past finally resting behind him, and the work of something better just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other videos on the channel to dive deeper into stories like this. And if you think someone else needs to see this, share the video and let them know.